Welcome once again to our show, and this is Frank Avila, your host. Thank you for watching. I want to thank everyone who makes this show possible. Freddie, the Oak Tree Oak, Joyce, the silent member of the show, William Gadomski, and Pops. Everybody who makes this show possible, including CAN TV. And if you like CAN TV, of course, support them. Tell your legislatures, your aldermen, so CAN TV public access network, cable access network, can stay here on television to have local and low-income people that maybe can't afford being on TV. So local origination, ethnic issues, neighborhood issues, things that are outside the purview of major corporations and major media. That's what we're about. But most of all, and most importantly, I want to thank our viewing audience. And I appreciate when you call me, or you call our show, or you send in letters or emails, or anything that you do to communicate with us, even if it's criticism. We like any feedback, whether it's compliment, which we do prefer, no doubt, criticism, which we still want feedback on how we're doing and what you think of our guests, so you find our shows interesting and we do a public service. Now today we have a good friend of ours, no stranger to our show, been on at least 3 times in the past, sometimes with his wife, lovely wife Mary, who's here in our viewing audience today, but a supporter of the life work of the couple together. We have Chris Fogarty, who is an author, a civil engineer by trade, by profession, an activist, and he and his wife Mary have made it their avocation, their love of telling people the truth on a number of issues, whether it be the McBride principles, which help the people of Northern Ireland, courageously doing that, getting a lot of legislators, both Irish American and non-Irish, of all sorts of stripes of Americans here in Chicago and Illinois about the McBride principles. Because I believe Danny Rostenkowski in the Congress did it. Roman Paczynski was a big supporter. Jeremiah Joyce, I think, helped, got him.
John
Alderman
McNamara.
Murphy, John McNamara, the state rep and the committeeman of Worth Township, Democratic committeeman.
And Tom Murphy, Alderman Tom Murphy at the time.
Alderman Sheehan at the time.
Yes.
And many others, Alderman Roman Paczynski. And I believe Jeremiah Joyce, because I talked to Mike Joyce, his son,
Yes.
and he told me that his dad got the McBride principles to Rostenkowski, who brought them into the Congress.
I see. Oh, the federal branch.
The
I
federal
got you.
branch,
Yes,
right,
indeed.
right.
Yes.
So that's one of the issues they worked on, which may be considered historical or not as applicable today, but I think it is actually, but we could talk about that in another show. But they've been involved with a lot of issues, whether it be the rights of other peoples and other nations that are persecuted, Native Americans, many, many other issues. But one of the most important issues that they are on is the historical remembrance of the genocide, the Holocaust of Irish Americans in, or Irish people, not Irish Americans, but Irish in Ireland in the mid-1800s. And there is a book that he wrote, which we're going to discuss today. As you can see, it's Ireland, 1845 to 1850, The Perfect Holocaust and Who Kept It Perfect. Now there's some controversy by some on the name Holocaust. We'll discuss that, and the use of the term genocide, and why some of us who believed that it was just a potato famine, because that's what we were taught, is not correct, and many other important issues that we're going to hear from Chris Fogarty today. And we want to thank Chris Fogarty for being on our show.
Thank you so very much.
And his wife Mary for working with him and also being here today in our viewing audience and being on our show many times in the past. Thank you very much. So let's talk about your book. And I know we have a number of exhibits that we're also going to show our viewing audience. And of course, one of the main exhibits that we've showed many times in our show. But why did you write the book?
Well, 5 million people were first murdered, and ever since then have been slandered, that they somehow, the lies that they died of terminal stupidity, that they grew only one failure-prone crop and fell into that trap of their own making. It is shocking that people would still be pursuing this falsehood to this day. The only way it can be kept going is by continuing to call it famine, which is the cover word for that genocide, and to keep covering up for the British Army and its removal of Ireland's abundant foods.
Now this story has deep roots. The British had ruled Ireland, invaded Ireland, took over Ireland, made it basically a colony of theirs.
Yes.
For about 845 years.
Exactly that.
Okay. Now, tell us a little bit, very briefly, how that happened, and how they invaded Ireland, how it came about, and then what that history is.
Pope Adrian IV issued Laudo Bellitere, a granting of Ireland to the King of England if that king would send the Peter's Pence annual donation from all churches in Ireland to Rome instead of sending it to Armagh, the seat of the Christian church in Ireland at the time. And so the Peter's Pence collections to this day in Ireland are still rewarding the Catholic Church for having sold out Ireland to the British.
Okay.
It's a strange setup, and many
Although
people.
Britain didn't have complete control at that time.
It took them a couple of centuries also.
Okay. I know
but
Henry VIII was one of the key players.
he came later. Actually, that's nearly half the genocide was already over before he came along. It started in 1170
With the
both-
Normans.
Well, the Norman Anglos. See, the Normans took England in 1066, and in 1170,
At the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror.
And then the last of them were rattling around Wales with nowhere to go. All the land was taken, and they decided to take Ireland. But they were the great-great-grandchildren of the Normans who took England.
Although interesting enough, the original inhabitants of England, and certainly even those who live in Wales, or at least those who are Welsh ethnicity, Cornish, the Cornwall, and
Welsh
Scotland,
and Scots.
are Celts, cousins to the Irish,
Yes.
if not brothers,
Yes.
but certainly cousins. And the original inhabitants of England were Celts.
Yes, that would be true. And they were modified by the Anglo-Saxons and others. that
Right. So
came
first
along.
you had the Anglo invasion.
Yes.
And then the Saxon invasion.
Yes.
And then in 1066 you had the Norman invasion.
Right.
Yeah.
So actually, Norman was the language of court England for quite a while.
Which was a French dialect.
Indeed.
Right.
Yes.
They were Viking descendants, but
They were indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
who
So
invaded Ireland in the centuries previous.
They had been rebuffed, and the Irish had defeated them in 970 something.
Byron Boru at the
Brian
Battle
Boru,
of
exactly. Brian Boru. Yes.
Byron Boru at the Battle of Clontarf.
At the Battle of Clontarf.
Clontarf. See.
Yes. So I'm here. I had a website preceded by a pamphlet that contained the basics, the fundamentals of the information in the book, and it forced the famine writers, the cover-up artists, it forced them to abandon some 90% of their falsehoods. They used to say, for example, Christine Keneally in a review in the Fortnight magazine of Cormac O'Grath's cover-up book, she said that his book would go a long way toward defeating the myth that has been passed glibly down generation to generation in Ireland, that food left Ireland while the people starved. So she was met by so many people from Boston down to Miami selling her book, asking her why she's covering up for the food removal, that she, in her very next book, she conceded that 4,000 shiploads of Irish grain alone sailed into Liverpool Harbour alone in 1847 alone. That should have resulted in her being moved out of academia, because she completely undid all her previous life's work.
So she contradicted her first book and her second book.
She contradicted her entire life. Her life's work prior to that was to say that there was no famine, that the people fell into a trap of their own making, and that Britain tried to save them. That was what she said, wrote, said, and
Now, is this being paid by the British government?
I don't know. You'd have to wonder how can it be, because the records that I used are from the National Archives in London, the British National Archives, and they're available to the public. So how these people can be scholars and not know how to get the basic information baffles me. Now, in school, in Castlereagh, taught by a Marist brother, he taught for his entire 50-year teaching career that it was a famine. And I spent a decade or so trying to get my old classmates to form a little group and accept a memorial for one of our town's 3 or 4 mass graves. And they were enthusiastic first and then became skittish about it. They really didn't want to do it because there's a price to pay for telling truth about the British in Ireland. And so they took my pamphlet to Brother Endo, who was retired in a nearby town of Strokestown, and said, "Brother, we're looking for errors in this. We'll be back in 2 weeks to hear what you have to tell us." So 2 weeks later they went back. Brother Endo said, "This is all true, to the extent I know, I'm pretty sure." And so they said, "Brother," with a cheek unknown in my time, "Brother, how can you say it's truthful when it contradicts everything you taught us in school about the famine?" And Brother Enda said, "I wish I didn't have to say this because it is shocking, disgraceful." Brother Enda said, "I had no choice. I had to teach the curriculum as provided to me by the government." So he knew what the truth was, and he taught a lie for his entire 50-year teaching career. Very sad. And he was very conscientious in all other areas. I still have a very high regard for him.
Now, although your book touches upon the 845 years of invasion, colonialization, and criminal rule and atrocities against the Irish, it focuses on the mid-1800s genocide against the Irish by the British of what is called the Great Potato Famine or the famine.
Yes.
And so that's the focus of the book.
The focus of the book for me is to be a voice for the murdered and later slandered 5 million people.
Okay.
That's my function here. That's the purpose of the book, to be a voice for those people who have no voice and have no other champions. But I must say there's a groundswell of support for them to vindicate them and their lives, to denounce those who both murdered them and then later, all these years, up until now, slander them.
Now, one of the issues that you debunk, one of the lies that you debunk, is that it was a potato famine, because that would assume that the only crop that Irish eat,
yes,
and of course one of the pejorative terms against Irish are potato eaters, is that it would assume that potatoes were the only crop that Irish people ate,
yes,
which would be absurd, because the English used Ireland because they had a large appetite for meat, for cows, and they basically grazed cows in Ireland, which hurt Irish people.
Well, that wasn't there was also a huge volume of all kinds of grains, of poultry products, of dairy products, in addition to beef and mutton and pork. All these agricultural crops were flowing out in tremendous numbers. You'll see.
But if there was an abundance of meat, you wouldn't have starved because there was a potato failure.
Precisely that. Or if there was an abundance of oats, but that was not available either. There was an abundance of wheat, that was not available. The landlords, with the backup of the British Army, said, "The non-existent potatoes are yours, Irish people. Everything else you've grown is mine, because it was grown on my land." And that was enforced by the British Army. And it's important to say here that the Irish did not give up easily. It took more British Army men to remove Ireland's food than what had been necessary to conquer the subcontinent of India, which today is India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. So more soldiers were removed. It took more soldiers to remove Ireland's food than it took to conquer what is down those 4 countries.
The jewel in the crown of the United Kingdom, the British Empire, but it took more to conquer Ireland and take out their food and kill the people. Now, you have a poster, which I have next to me, which we've shown many times on the show in the past, but maybe this is the time to bring it out, because you mentioned that not only was it the export of the food, but soldiers killing people and soldiers forcing the crops to be exported. So, first of all, tell me first of all, how do you done the research? Because you've done a lot of research in this book. You don't. This isn't just your opinion or your speculation. You really back it up.
Yes.
So first, tell me about the research you've done to validate this book.
I'll just mention that the little crosses here are all mass graves. There are about 170 here, and there are a great many more have been added in the book. And the Union Jacks are all the locations of named British regiments that stripped the foods from those areas. But the source of that information came from the Public Records Office in London. And that information came from this. This is a photocopy of the original handwritten disposition of the Army records. And is this visible here? Shall I turn it this way?
Yeah, let me get the camera.
And so
I don't know if they can see the names, but they certainly can see the document.
Yes. So this is a photocopy of the original handwritten records of the time. There are 4 sheets. Each the army takes up 4 of these sheets, and there are 6 years. And so this is list all of the soldiers, where they were at any given, move it out of one place and move to another. This shows what part of Ireland they moved into, what part of within Ireland they moved within, and then later when they moved out of Ireland. It gives the date they moved out, and it shows where they went. So this is the official record. This is undeniable. And also then, whether they were...
And this is from the National Archives of Ireland?
Of England.
Of
Britain.
England.
Yes, out in Kew, outside London.
So this is English archives,
right,
and English records of what was sent to Ireland.
Thank you for making that clear.
Okay.
Exactly.
So it's not even Irish records; it's
right.
English records.
Yes.
Okay.
They can never destroy them, because they are the history of Britain.
And the British kept pretty diligent records.
Yes. Now they haven't kept the records of their food removal and their manifests of taking the food aboard the ships, but on the other side, when they landed in England or elsewhere, the landings are all of Irish food, are all well recorded. And so I've used enough. They're abundant, and the amount of food being brought in is a torrent. So I've only shown 4 or 5 listings that take up a couple of 4 or 5 pages, densely printed pages, of how many kegs of this, how many barrels of that, how many head of cattle, how many swine, pigs that were shipped over, what port they arrived in. So that's all completely covered. That again is from the Times, but we know it to be the London Times.
Right.
So that's from the London Times. So then we're left with the big lie having not much place to exist. So once they had to admit that food left Ireland while the people starved, and that was a very late concession on the part of the so-called famine writers, they then developed a brand new lie starting maybe 8 or 10 years ago. And that lie is that it was the rich Irish starving the poor Irish. Again, a brand new lie that had not been necessary before. And so now it's the rich Irish starving the poor Irish. I debunked that in the book also by pointing out that the British government repatriated all its landlords from Ireland between 1900 and 1910. And also this book here, the Great Landowners of Great Britain and Ireland, published in 1878, shows how many acres each landlord had. Now this happens to include England, Scotland, and Ireland. So I went through it, and I got all of the Irish landlords, the so-called Irish landlords, the English landlords in Ireland, and how many acres they had. And I must say, the Anglican Church had tens of thousands of acres of land, even
and
for
that was
the
the Church of England, which became the Church of Ireland, but
yes,
really was the Church of England.
They called it the Church of
that
Ireland.
almost no indigenous Irish were members of, or very few.
Zero. There were many attempts to convert. In fact, one of the great pejorative words throughout Ireland to this day is a super. And that's one who, while starving, took a bowl of soup as a price for renunciation of his Catholic faith.
Right.
And I wish they had all taken the soup at the time. They could have deconverted later. But at that time, evidently people thought that to take an oath was binding forever, and there was just no way out of it. So that happened. I know of a couple of locations where there are maybe 8 or 10 families that took the soup. One outside Bantry in County Cork, not Bantry, doesn't come to me now, just west of Cork City, and another one near Ballinlough, County Roscommon. But they, very, very few.
So let's take a look at this book. It's The Great Landowners of Great Britain and Ireland by John Bateman with an analysis, and that is the book. I don't know if you can do a up close on that or not, but at least showing it. So it's an older book, obviously.
You can see you can see the date on the back of it, 1878.
1878. Now, I'm also looking at some notes that I have that, there were some allegations by some of the writers on, quote, the Great Famine, unquote, that the landlords were Irish and not English, and that they were the rich Irish picking on the poor Irish, or it was the Irish mismanaging their crops and food. But you have given a number of names in the book of their non-Irish family names, their English titles, their English clubs, their English addresses, English schools, their British Army rankings, and that between 1900 and 1910, the British government repatriated most of them, or all of them, to England. And that, of course, you had showed me some photos even of some of them. I don't know if we have some of those photos, but some of the photos of where they live now, their descendants, and their names.
Yeah, it might interest our watchers to say that General Pakenham, the British general who died in his attack on New Orleans in 1814 or 15, you know the song, Down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico, he died there. He was a landlord with 3 different locations in Ireland. And then General Ross, who burned the White House in 1812, I think it was. And
the War of 1812.
Yeah. He died a couple of days later in his attack on Baltimore, where the American national anthem was created. He led that attack on Baltimore, and he died there too. He was another landlord in Ireland, like Pakenham in New Orleans, General Ross from Baltimore, who died there. He was another landlord in Rostrevor, up in the northeastern part of the country. And you can see this book shows the clubs they belonged to, and the schools they went to, and their titles. And it just happens that the landlords of Ireland, there was a very high percentage, not a majority, but a very high percentage of them were lords in the House of Lords in England. They also had estates in England. The landlord that evicted my great-grandparents and grandaunts and uncles, my grandfather wasn't born yet, he was Henry Flowers. He had some 30,000 acres around Durrow in County Laois. He evicted my great-grandfather and mother from their land in Ballykeely, Durrow, County Laois, and they wandered, and they were told that they could build an emergency shelter for themselves in the shadow of the Lord's gallows, to have them handy in case he should take a dislike to them. And so, with nowhere else to go, they lived there for a few years. My grandfather was born in that emergency shelter in 1839, and shortly after that they moved down the hill into the town and got into a house. And when he turned 18, sad to say, he joined the British Army, because just like the young men in Iraq today, under control of others, there were nothing available except a serf for the landlord, a spy for the British government, a British soldier, a British constable. The choices were very, very few. There was no free enterprise.
And that's one of the reasons you had such emigration from Ireland to the United States and other nations. You find the Irish are everywhere. Australia.
There's
New
something
Zealand.
called chain migration, and you can have an event like the Holocaust of Ireland. They will get the initial impetus going strongly, and then even though the conditions improve, they draw their nieces and nephews out after them, and it goes on generation after generation. My ancestors here in Chicago worked on the Illinois-Michigan Canal. That's why we're here, and they came at that time. The starvation was on at that time in Ireland. And so they came here then, and there's been chain migration ever since. And I must say, I'm so grateful to those who came here. This is the nation. This is the best nation on earth.
And a lot of Irish came to New York.
Yes.
Boston. Some worked on the railroads.
Many.
Yeah. Many joined the military, were either forced into the military or volunteered in the Civil War and the U.S.-Mexico War.
Yes. I've been to Boston a few times, and when I've been there, I usually say, keep going west, you're only halfway to America. Because when the Irish arrived in Boston, everything had been carved up, everything was already divvied up, and there wasn't much room or concessions given to the newcomers. But they got in at the beginning of Chicago, and particularly those who went to California, they were among the original ones there. They didn't participate too badly in the genocide of the Native Americans, but I must say they were in the 7th Cavalry, and so even survivors of a genocide in Ireland, as members of the 7th Cavalry and other regiments here, participated in the genocide against the Native Americans. Not many, but some.
Now, some Irish also moved to England,
Many.
and
They do to this day.
some Irish also fought for the British.
In great numbers. My grandfather, the man who was born in the shadow of the Lord's gallows in Durrow, County Laois, he was a career British soldier. I've learned, I thought it was okay. I've become embarrassed to say it, but he had no options. His sister died between their house in Durrow and the post office where she would go to collect his army pay. He, as a British soldier, supported his siblings and maybe his parents. I don't know how much longer they lived. But she died somewhere between the post office and her house seeking his pay. So it was truly, truly dire. Shocking what our ancestors have gone through.
I think there was even Irish Brigade.
There was earlier ones, and there were Irish brigades in the United States.
Right.
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah.
And then
indeed.
many Irish went to Spanish-speaking lands, either Spain, South America, Mexico, Juan O'Donoghue.
That was in the 1600s.
Right.
That was the destruction of Ireland's aristocracy.
Right.
Yeah. It's all very sad. I wish, in a sense, I never learned. By the way, a little aside here. A year ago, I picked up a book at Plummer's Hall, the only very old book there that I noticed, and it was about the tomb of a 3,000-year-old Irish king. Pretty interesting, about Old Castle, County Meath. In the preface to it, it describes how one of the four masters had moved to Ballycroy back in the bogs of West Mayo over near the ocean, and had two sons to whom he had left his only treasure, his books. When Queen Elizabeth had wiped out about half the population, and
Queen Elizabeth I,
exactly, thank you, indeed.
the daughter of Henry VIII.
Yes, in the end of the 1500s and the early 1600s. A few scholars got together and thought, Ireland and everyone in it is doomed. We will dedicate a few years of our lives to provide the history of the nation that used to be, make a record of what has been here, that it might survive all of us. We won't survive, but the books might. And so they spent 4 years in the convent, the Franciscan convent of Donegal, and they wrote what is today called the Annals of the Four Masters. And it goes back to pre-Christian times, from all the available written sources at the time. And so I was wondering, could it possibly be that there would be a descendant of them? I have a set of Irish national phone books in my house, so I looked through it, West Mayo, and I found a number of, no O'Clearys, but Clearys. And so I thought, you see, in Ireland, just like the Fogarty, many people drop the O's and the Mocks off their name. Mock is son of, O is in the line of. And that was dropped off in order to appear less Irish, when you could be killed for being Irish. When the law did not protect any Irish person, they were being legally non-persons, stripped of their legal personhood. So the first one I called Martin.
Now, Mac means son of.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And whether it's MAC or MC, means the same. So I called Martin Joe Cleary, and I said to call him who I was and what I had just read, and would he possibly be a descendant of one of the four masters. He said, well, it has been said a few times, but we don't have any proof. I said, that's a pity. Has any priest or scholar or school teacher historian ever contacted you to find out? He said, no. Well, I said, just for your information, the man who was said to have fled Donegal and gone into Ballycroy, he had two names. One was Fogarty, evidently an old Gaelic name, gone out of use, and the other one was Peregrine. Well, he said, I have a cousin, Peregrine, who left here years ago, moved to England, never came back, died there recently. Well, I said, you've just established that you and all your cousins are descendants of one of the four masters, and you should be very pleased with that. They wrote in Gaelic, but they were fluent. This one man had taught in Spain in different places, and had both gone to university there and taught there.